Hello, everybody. This is Deirdre von Krauskopf of Going Beyond the Call, and we're having a continuation of our Domestic Violence Awareness Month, where we want to share, beyond the people that are going beyond the call, in these support ranks and bringing the message out to the world and ensuring that that bridge between law enforcement and military and survivors and victims is heard in a way that gets people motivated to help and be part of the movement. And like in Sean's book, The Movement Process, we all have to go through a process to move forward. And when we've gone through a trauma and we get to a place where we have become self-comfortable with our experiences, that's the time to share it. There's a lot of people out there that do not understand that other people are going through very similar or same issues, or even sometimes worse issues. So getting the message out there is very important. And Sean and I are really excited to invite Cynthia Hayle, who is a World Peace Ambassador. She's a Global Goodwill Ambassador. She's won a Humanitarian Award. She's the founder of FFT Helping Others, and she was the one that invited us to the October 1st Domestic Violence Awareness Rally. And we're really excited to share her story, because during that rally, there was things that we know about her, in the pre-conversations that I think are so critical to get out there. So Cynthia, I want to invite you and just ask you to share a little bit about your journey and the challenges between the military world, the civilian police world, and how did that make you feel when it came to reaching out or feeling that there was someone out there that had a hand that you could grasp onto in your worst possible times?
Sure, I would love to. So my name is Cynthia Hayle. I am the founder of FFT Helping Others. And like you said, I'm also the founder of the Domestic Violence Rally. About 17 years ago plus, my children and I were domestically abused. I actually was domestically abused by my ex-husband in the military at Cherry Point, North Carolina. Before that, we were stationed in Quantico, and then after that, we were stationed at Cherry Point. And like you said, I was domestically abused, and it didn't start off as domestic violence. It started off as love, compassion, understanding love, and it started off as, how do you say, being loving. It never started off as a hateful thing until I got pregnant. And then he said, let's go ahead and get ourselves a place off base. And I said, sure, I think that would be a great thing, So as we got a place off base and I was pregnant, that's when the abuse started worse. I was getting first domestic abuse mentally, then emotionally, and then it proceeded to be physical. First started off with him grabbing me very forcefully, and then it started with him hitting me once, and then him, apologizing. And people say, well, if he hit you the first time, why wouldn't you just leave? And what people don't seem to understand is I was in the middle of nowhere with absolutely no finances, nowhere to leave, nowhere to go, and I was also pregnant. And when people think about that, they're just like, well, you could find a way for you to divorce him immediately and gain half of his finances through the military. But that's not the way it goes with the military. It doesn't work that way. Many people don't seem to understand that when you're in the military, it's not the same as the civilian world. Many people who have had issues like that, they become homeless and have to wait for a long period of time before they even get anything. Then it's just progressed onto him hitting me in my stomach while I was pregnant with my son, and I had to cover myself. And then I just constantly was covering myself, and he would hit me in my back. And eventually it just progressed to him saying, I, can literally kill you anytime with any of my military, background. I can kill you and no one can find your body. You know, you will do what I say anytime that I say, and I promise you, no one will ever find you, you know. And I was so scared. I was afraid that if I ever did leave, he would find me. And, you know, I knew of his military background. I knew he was a Marine and who could find me. And, you know, that was another thing, another reason why I was afraid. You know, that was the other, you know, thing of me being fearful, because I was like, he can find me. He could find me, you know? And there was lots of times where he would take the airs out of the tires. He would take the spark plugs out, you know, of the car. He would leave me home alone, and there was times where he would limit the amount of food that was I could intake, you know, and I was not allowed on base unless I went with him. You know, I couldn't go to the PX, I couldn't go to the commissary. And so it wasn't until a friend of his, who actually was his buddy, noticed a lot of this stuff. And he was like, I know that he's hitting you, you know, and I know what's going on. He says, is he allowing you on base? And I said, no, he's not. And he's like, I'm going to take and bring you back my truck so you can go to the commissary. And then I had to learn how to drive a truck, literally, without me knowing how to drive a truck. Mm-hmm. And it was literally, it was scary because I didn't know how to drive a stick shift. I had no idea how to. And this guy who didn't know me from Adam literally taught me how to drive a stick shift, literally. And that was the only way I could get on base onto the PX so I can buy myself just a little bit, just to the commissary, just so that I can get myself any food, any sustenance. And even with that, I still had to hide a certain amount of food just so that he would not get upset. And this happens consistently with lots of families. It happens a lot, yeah, all the time.
I think it does. And Sean, you see that a lot as a law enforcement officer, and I know you experienced it as a child, and I know that still impacts you from our last conversation, but can you share with others, like, how many times do you see this, where it's the manipulation and the control and the psychological trauma, not just being hit, but how people get into another person's brains and diminish their self-worth and feed on their survival skills?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the psychological breakdown is almost more destructive than the physical side of it when you look at these victims of domestic violence. And a lot of times they don't have a mark on them, but up here they're destroyed. My mom, she was a very strong woman like yourself. She was very uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Self-sufficient. Single mom taking care of me, and then she went from single mom, strong-willed, purpose-driven, to a woman that was depending on somebody else, that felt like she had to do whatever she was told to do when she was told to do it, and he basically groomed her into the type of really a slave, if you think about it, because it really is a form of slavery the way that it's done. It's so manipulative and so um absorbing that after a while you just become it. And I see it all the time. It's almost like that like they're looking, not, they don't look at you, they're looking through you, because they can't focus. There's so much fear and so much anxiety and despair, and it's a really tragic thing to see. And I really appreciate you, Cynthia, telling your story, because I know it's not easy, and I think it's important, Dee, that we also remind the audience that if you're out there and you're watching this, there are some things that are going to be said here that could trigger you. And
Yeah.
if that's the case, understand that it's okay for those emotions to come up, and maybe it's a reminder that you need to address those things, that you need to go back and deal with those things, because if you don't, they're always going to trigger you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we talked a little bit about it, but people think of the fight, flight, freeze response, as physically running away or
Yeah.
physically hiding or physically freezing up. It's really not that, in its entirety. There's aspects to each one of those behaviors that we don't necessarily understand in our general assumptions of what fight, flight, or freeze is. And in freezing, Sean said it really great. People get into a numbing place. They get into, it hurts too much. I'm just going to hide away within myself. And that could look like Netflix binging. It could be laziness. It could be sleeping all the time. It could mask signs and symptoms of what you might see for depression. And all that is the person in a survival mode just trying to freeze away from that overwhelming sense of what the heck is going on. And my brain can't manage this person that
Yes.
loved me that's now hurting me. And I don't understand, but I have to protect my family. I have to, I might have financial hardships. I might not know who to go to. I might be embarrassed or ashamed of what happened to me. All those things kind of, you can fill up somebody's brain to the point where they are frozen and they don't know how to make that next step. And people don't see that. Or the fawn response, where we become overly people pleasing. I can change him. He said he loved me. He said he's sorry, or she. Quite frankly, domestic abuse can happen to either sex. So they get into this overwhelming need that if I just do better, I can fix my family. I can fix my love. I can fix this thing. And so the freeze and fawn response become very, very common in domestic abuse and child abuse, and also sex trafficking. And it's all that manipulation and control that we don't necessarily understand that's happening to us, because we're in this traumatic, very basic instinctual need
Yeah.
to protect ourselves. And sometimes we feel this is the best thing I can do with the knowledge that I have right now. This is the best thing I can do so I don't get hurt worse, or my family doesn't get hurt worse. And so that's the message you want to go out there and make sure everybody understands, that you need to reach out and you need to go through a healing process. And Cynthia, we were talking earlier about your journaling, your book. So I'd like you to share a little bit about your book and how that is helping you manage all that you went through, and
Yeah.
also helping you kind of build the story that you want to use to help others.
So my book is called The Place of Healing. It's a journey journal. And so believe it or not, even though I have been through this process, 17 years ago, and each journey chapter is a different place in my life and my children's life and even my mother's life, because she herself went through domestic violence with my dad, and she herself has gone through some traumatic experience. I think I was discussing with you about lament. Lament can be different things. Lament can also be lamenting something in your life, like cancer. I went through cancer. She also was lamenting my grandmother through cervical cancer. And you can also lament, when you're going through domestic violence. You can lament when you're, facing a traumatic experience and you have not dealt with it. And so sometimes when you are lamenting, or when you are not dealing with it, you're deep down just saying, okay, I'm going to deep down it and just not worry about it and just keep piling things on top and not really go through that process. But sometimes we don't go through processes of our lives. We don't reflect, we don't lament, we don't, take time to meditate, we don't seek, and we don't look through things in our lives. And so this place of journeying, and so this book is called Place of Healing, because everything in our lives is kind of like a big house. We have to go through each single room. And sometimes when we go through each single room, we have to clean it out. Sometimes we have to take a journey and clean out our house. And we're not going to start off and say, okay, I cleaned a little bit of that room and that's it. That's good. That's not how emptying a house and cleaning it out through a cleaning process goes. No, you have to go through that exact room and you really have to clean. When you're doing what we call cleaning day, we have to clean that whole entire room and say, I'm going to really clean out the closet. Everything's going to go out. I do not want to wear those nasty 80s shoes anymore. They're not going to be worn. They're going to the thrift store, okay? And so you have to clean out your rooms, but you're not going to stop until you're finished with that room. And then it's time for the next room. And so that's kind of what this journal is. And then also be able to jot down what you've learned through that process. It's like, okay, I've learned in the process that I really did not work through, my grandmother's passing, or I didn't learn through, my husband hurting me, or things like that. And I needed to let go, things in which we have to journal out. And so I feel like a lot of people journal, or a lot of people like to draw, a lot of people like to paint, a lot of people like to poet, a lot of people like to sing, but a lot of people miss out on doing things that are very therapeutic. And I think a lot of us who are therapists understand those counseling venues of burning letters, or being able to learn these things. But it is a place of healing, of being able to learn how to process. Yeah.
I think that's really, really important for everything. I know in our training class and our workbook, we have quizzes to help people kind of find out where they're at, and what they might have to consider working on in
Yeah.
various different areas. So there's little places to start that journaling process. And it's incredibly cathartic for a lot of people. And I know, Sean, you wrote an amazing book. If you could share a little bit about the movement process, because that has launched your journey to really help other people.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And not necessarily about the book, but about the power of taking what's up here, running it through here, and writing it out or typing it out. In my case, I typed everything out when I did it. There was something very powerful about that, about finally pulling those memories that were way back here and pulling them to the front and forcing yourself to have to go back and think about those things so that you could pour it out into a story and create a book and in my case, form a process that you started to build as you were going through the healing process. And I was curious, Cynthia, like how powerful was that for you, or is it, I should say, because you're still doing it, for it to go from here, and as you're writing it out, does it feel like you're releasing something, or was that just something that I'm thinking that might not be the case?
Actually, I'm still going. My book is still in the process. I was just telling Deidre that it's still a work in progress because, my book is set to be going out in about 2.5 more months. And each chapter is a different chapter to a different, almost like a different room. And, but it's so healing because I find that it's not just about myself. I'm talking about different people in my book, which is about my son and what my sons have gone through too. And I've had to ask their permission because I've asked them, can I tell your story and how your story has been impactful to you? And I'm thankful to my one son who's gone through an issue of, I don't want to give it too much away, but
Yeah.
but I've had to ask my oldest son who's gone through something in his life, physically in his life, and I said, "Can I tell your story?" And he said, "Mommy, I would love for you to share my story because I know that people are going through the same issue in their life. And I know how hard it could be for them to deal with that same thing in their own life. And I want them to heal and know that if I can do it, they can do it,
That's so
And
So,
inspiring.
that's such a powerful thing, man, because you're right. I really do believe we all have a story. And although our story is not for everyone, it's definitely for someone. So I'm really excited to hear that you're putting a book out. I know it was very healing for me, and
yeah,
I've been able to impact a lot of lives with it, and you will too. And it's really exciting when you can take your adversity and turn it into resiliency, and then teach other people how to take what they've gone through
yeah.
and turn their adversities into resiliency and strength and encouragement and all those things that go along that line. So congratulations, man. That's really cool.
I'm
It really
excited.
is. And I know we learn so much from people when we do our seminars and we go out, we meet people, everyone does have a story. And most people don't recognize how much their story can reach the person who has been hitting their head against a wall because they don't know what to do. And they
Mhm.
just need to connect to someone. So the more stories that are out there, the more we increase the ability for someone to say, oh my gosh, it's not just me. There's other people out there. There's help out there. There's things I can do to get out of the scenario and situation, and that can kind of break that desire to fight or flee or freeze or fawn. It can get them out of that place that is holding them back. And I know that even for me, when I wrote Unquiet Warrior, I'm not quite comfortable or ready to put it out there published yet, but I'm okay with telling my story. So it takes time sometimes, and don't feel bad if you start writing stuff down and it doesn't, get out to the world right away.
Yeah.
It still builds your ability to share it and get it out there. But I do want to touch on one more thing, because I know our time is ticking down. And Sean, if you could help me with this. Our audience is military and police and, first responders and dispatchers and corrections personnel, all the people that are part of this justice system and the system that kind of has this very protective family. We don't want to share our dirty laundry. We don't want to get this bad news out there. And that almost stigma issue has a real impact on helping victims, whether they're child or spouses, really reach out and do what they need to do to get themselves out of that place of trauma. So Sean, as a police officer, how would you address the MPs? How would you address fellow police officers, EMTs that show up at these different sites? How do you help them ask the right questions, have the right body language, be able to show that empathy that gives people that first line of healing rather than just being a first line of defense? How do we start that conversation and help people?
I think it starts with teaching them trauma-informed care principles in order to really understand that it's not about what's wrong with people, it's about what happened to people, helping them to understand what trauma is and what trauma is not. Somebody asked me a really unique question today. They said that they were writing a paper for their PhD, and they reached out to me and they said, "Hey, I got a lot of people that are making this argument that trauma and resiliency are the same thing, and that when they implement trauma principles, that they're creating resiliency." And I said, I don't think we can say that trauma and resiliency are the same thing, but they definitely need each other, right? Without trauma, you don't have resiliency, and without understanding resiliency and the good side, you would never recognize the bad side either. So
Right.
Trauma leads to resiliency, right?
Right.
The more trauma that we face and the more that we address it and go through it and become more superior over it, especially in law enforcement and first responders and the military, the more resilient we become to it. So I would say that it needs to focus on trauma-informed care training to help them to understand what trauma is, to recognize what the stress of trauma does on the short term and the long term, not only how stress absorbs and impacts them, but how it absorbs into their family, into their lives. The things that we should be looking for, the precursors that we should be looking for. And it shouldn't just be the police officers and first responders and military. It should be their families getting this training too, so that it's reverse engineering 101. They're seeing it as well. So when I walk in the house and Lynn sees that I'm not talking at all and I don't want to hug my kids, she knows something is not right, because you know me,
Right.
D. I love my kids. I hug my kids all the time, and I love my wife. But you got to be able to recognize those signatures. And unfortunately, we have not been trained well. We haven't been trained at all
Yeah.
in how to understand the social emotional aspects of what we deal with. So now we go to deal with a situation like Cynthia's and an abusive husband, and we get stuck because we don't know the answers. We don't have the solutions because we've never really been trained in how to interact and how to address those situations in order to effectively, be able to look Cynthia in the eyes and say, "Hey," and this is what I do. I mean, when I'm dealing with domestic violence and specifically with women that I see caught in the cycle of abuse, and you hear it in their voice. I know he's going to change. I know it's going to get better. And I finally break down. I tell them a little bit of my story, and it starts with us humanizing ourselves and being willing to be vulnerable and say, "Hey, look, as a human being, not as somebody in uniform, but as somebody as a human being, saying, hey, look, my mom went through 30 years of abuse, so I do understand this more than you realize. I'm
Yeah.
never going to say that I get what you're going through because everybody's trauma is different, but I do understand domestic violence and I do understand the challenges with it. And I'm here to help you. What happened that led to you feeling like you can't get out of this situation? And then it goes into those questions, D. What have you tried so far? How did that work? And we start to coach the victims right into survival mode because they go, well, have you ever heard of this resource? Or have you ever heard of Cynthia Hayle and domestic violence programs and, all the different resources? And all of a sudden, you give them light at the end of the tunnel that they never saw because all they've been able to see is pure darkness because of the fear and the deception and the manipulation and all the things that have been impacting them up to this point.
Absolutely. And I'm going to touch on just like a taboo subject for a moment. Often the people that are the perpetrators, the people that we don't necessarily look to support or put out a reaching hand, especially in the world of, military and first responders, corrections, all of those have actually high domestic abuse charges, in those worlds. And we don't really necessarily equate why. Right? So these are all careers and jobs that have incredibly high stress levels, are incredibly controlled, either a military or paramilitary organization where you're told to do what you're told. You're supposed to follow your command without question. And any frustration you have, any anger you have, any self-doubts, all that stuff that is normal in any person's life or organizational career, there's no outlet. There's no outlet. There's no teaching that says, hey, listen, when you're starting to feel this, well, that's anger. This is the emotional response that's normal. This is the frustration that's normal. This is how you become an emotionally mature adult, to be able to understand these things and then how to manage them. There's no training for that right now. So those people go home and the only outlet that they're really in control is their household. And so if they've never learned how to manage their own trauma, they've never understood, adverse childhood experiences, they have no comprehension of how to manage that overwhelming buildup that happens inside them, and then they go home and they take it out on the person they love. Well, that is another cycle, and it's very typical. Unfortunately, it's very typical in these very controlled careers. And so we want to make sure that when we talk about training, it's not only the victims that we want to help. We want to help the perpetrators too, because statistically, when we look into corrections, those that have been arrested for domestic abuse go on and abuse again.
Yeah.
The repeat offenders is huge, whether it's the same spouse or somebody new. So really, a really comprehensive program like ours dives down into everybody's issue from childhood on, how everyone can improve their emotional intelligence, how everyone can improve their strategic communication skills so they understand how to communicate what's going on within them within appropriate boundaries. And so when we share this program, it really is all about psychological, which is all very important, but also the physiological. What happens when you try to hide it all in the vault and never talk about it? That builds up, and it builds out often in addictions and unhealthy outlets, and that's the problem that we're trying to resolve. And it certainly impacts relationships, kind of that tri area. And so all of this is very important in personal relationships, but it's also important for recognizing things like the sex trade. So Cynthia, I want to bring it up because I know you have another rally coming up. I want to kind of turn it now to how do we take this knowledge that we understand people are in these trauma spaces, and how do we empathize with that other kind of unspoken or taboo thing that's out there that really a lot of people are unaware of, and that is the current, sex industry and the slave industry.
I wanted to touch on what you were talking about just a minute ago before I even get into that. I was just talking to Senator McPike's legislative assistant, and I was actually inviting him to what we're just about to have, which is another rally in Richmond on October 17th. We're going to be having one down in Richmond on October 17th at 5:45, and we've invited him, we've invited Senator Warner, and some of our wonderful sheriffs to be there, and some of our police officers. And he himself was also a victim of military abuse, him and his mother. And it saddens me because he says, my mom was a victim of domestic violence in the military, but she was all the way in Germany. And, it saddens me because, my dad just didn't know he had a problem. And the problem is that he had mental health issues that were never addressed. And, we didn't get to know until the very, very end where he passed away that he did have problems. And it wasn't until you were speaking that I was explaining to him when I was over the phone, I had a wonderful panel. And I said, please listen to my panel. I had some great speakers of going beyond the call. And I said, you really need to hear them. And so Senator Mix-Pike's, legislative assistant, he went through some horrible, horrible things in his life as a child, him and his mother. And to know that they had gone through such trauma, and she had to fly back to Germany to go back to the base to face her offender and to face his dad, and not knowing what could have happened to her. And the problem is legislation. And, I always say is that we have to change legislation. We have to change, the Lautenberg Amendment. We have to change the Victims Against Women's Act to combine the two. And so I feel that it's the same thing with, our human and our sex trafficking issues, is that we really have to work together because there is such a problem in our states. And if it's not for our police officers working together with us, we really would not be able to get a lot of these victims off of the streets. And a lot of them are being utilized, being manipulated by these pimps, and they are being abused consistently all the time. And some of them can even be utilized by their own family members. They can be, being human trafficked by their own, family members, by their own moms, dads, uncles, aunts. And, we've had so many that have been calling us and saying, hey, I'm being human trafficked by my dad. And so we've had phone calls like that all the time. So, although there is a spectrum in which we say, certain police officers may have, it can be that there is police officers that may have, but there are great police officers out there that help us and assist us and do some amazing work. I mean, amazing work. I'm so thankful for them. I really am thankful because they do awesome work, awesome work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think this is a really important topic and subject, and we don't necessarily understand it as well as we could. And I know that, when people get into, again, whether it's PTSD, a lot of people suffering PTSD don't know that they're suffering PTSD. They're
Yeah.
in denial. They don't understand it. They just think it's part of the job, right? And they
Yeah.
shove all their feelings and emotions in that vault. The problem with vaulting, is that it's still a space that can only contain so much. And when that explodes, it explodes in all kinds of different ways, whether that's, through, addictions and abuse and, negative circumstances in that way, whether it's sometimes we've talked to people who over-exercised, like to the point where their body was breaking down. So they think they're doing something healthy, but they're doing it too extreme. We've had people that, just cannot have a relationship. They don't know how to manage past, the rose-colored glasses, any amount of conflict or stress, and they're out of there. They can't manage it. So it comes in a lot of different ways, including, I can't tell you how many police officers we've spoken to that are retired, and nothing came kind of out and bubbled up until after they retired. And then all of a
Yeah.
sudden they're sitting there, they have no more responsibility. And this would be very similar to a military person. They're no longer serving that purpose that drove them for so many years. And now all of a sudden they're having the nightmares and the memories, and things are bubbling up, and they don't know what it is or how it's hurting their bodies. And, in all of those professions, there's higher rates of cancer and, Alzheimer's and other diseases that come up because the body,
Right.
regardless of whether you think you're tucking it away, the body's still trying to manage all that stress. And so all of that stuff is really important for people to understand. And then also on top of that, to have legislation that recognizes all these linking factors. It's not just mental fitness, it's health and it's relationships and it's all those things kind of together. And I think that that's important to, the work that you're doing is so important to actually get legislation to change how we view it so that we can
Yeah.
actually help more people. Do you have any other things you want to share with us, Cynthia, as far as what's coming up this month? I know you had a few things going on. I want to make sure you get everything out there.
Yeah. So on the 10th, we are October 10th, we are having training called What is DV Really? I really think that a lot of people just don't really know what domestic violence really is and IPV really is. And so Evangelist Patricia Fowler and I are trained both under the DOD and the DOJ, plus the CDC. And we are having a training on that day to really explain to people what domestic violence really is. I don't really think that a lot of people know there are so many scales of domestic violence. And, there's psychological abuse, there is, mental abuse, there's social abuse, there is financial abuse. And not only that, there's spiritual abuse. And when we did this training before, somebody came back to us and told us, there's spiritual abuse? And I was like, yeah. And so, but we're doing this training so that people can be certified under FFT Helping Others, for one. And two, it's just to bring awareness and so that people can know that. And then the second thing is that we are, of course, going to be under Guidance to a Good Heart. We're doing one Sunday, every Sunday, of course, having new people every Sunday. We would love to have you guys on again on one of the Sundays and have you guys there. And, on the 11th, we're going to be doing the Day of the Girl on Guidance to a Good Heart, because it is the Day of the Girl, which was done by the UN, and it's the Day of the Girl. It was proclaimed as a day of to stop genital mutilation for young girls in European countries. And that was because so much genital mutilation was done to stop girls from being human trafficked. And so they would do it automatically when they started, immediately at the ages of 6, 7 years old. Moms would automatically do it. But they did Day of the Girl so that girls can attend school, so girls can be anything they want to be. They could be doctors if they wanted to, psychologists, psychiatrists. They can be anything they wanted to be and not worry about being human trafficked. And so that's why it's called the Day of the Girl. I hope that people look it up. And then on the 17th, of course, we're doing in the Richmond City over by the Bell Tower, we are going to be doing a vigil called Purple Roses, and we're bringing purple roses to recognize not only domestic violence victims and survivors, but also human trafficking and sex trafficking that's so vital here in the nation. It's just horrible how many children are utilized, and also people are being utilized for human and sex trafficking acts.
I think it's interesting that you said, we were talking last time, even student visas. People are coming over and staying in people's homes over here. So, like as a mom and dad, you're sending your child, overseas, thinking you're giving them a great education, and staying in
Yes.
someone's home so they can be part of a family unit. And to find out that the person's passport's been taken away, they're not allowed to go to school, they're forced to do, servitude, and labor and stuff. So there's many layers to the trafficking that, again,
Yeah.
we don't recognize and understand. And I love what you guys are doing.
Yeah.
Sean, do you have anything else to share from the law enforcement or military perspective that can wrap this up?
I would just say, again, I want to just thank you, Cynthia, for coming on and sharing your story. I know it takes a lot of encouragement to be able to share your story, and greatly appreciate it. I know it's helped a lot of people today, and I'm very excited to see who who reaches out, from this, because sometimes that's all it takes is just hearing from somebody who's been through it and found a way out. And I want to congratulate you for all your amazing success, for all the wonderful things that you're doing, all the ways you've taken your adversity and turned it into resiliency, and are now are helping other people to get unstuck. So thank you so much for being here today.
Definitely. Thank you guys, and congratulations to you both. I hope we will be able to do a conference soon.
Yes, that'll be awesome.
Yes, we'll get together very soon.
Perfect. Thanks, everybody.